Hi friends, glad you're with us, whether you're using this on Sunday morning as your opportunity for worship or some other time during the weekend or during the week. Welcome. We're glad that you're here and you're a part of it. Doing something just a little bit different today as we wrap up the end of the series on Sabbath that we have been in. So we've got a conversation that I had with Callie and with Dave Roberts. Really great conversation talking about Sabbath and some of our thoughts and some really practical stuff. We hope that it's beneficial, that it's a great resource to you. I will go ahead and tell you that we had a recording glitch in the middle of it. Unintentionally, the camera got zoomed in, so everything was great, and then it got zoomed in. Picture gets a whole lot prettier because you don't have to look at me or Dave anymore. You only see Callie for the last 2/3 of the video probably, but you hear all of us and you have a great conversation. So watch Callie, ignore Dave and me, but listen as we share that conversation with you and wrap up this conversation on Sabbath. But before we get to that, I want to share a story that's been on my mind a lot the last several weeks as we've thought about Sabbath. It's an Old Testament story that really, I think, is just kind of just beautiful in the way that it reads and the power of it and the majesty of what we can see taking place in it. And it has been a good reminder to me of what God is doing and how God is working. So let me share with you this story that comes out of 1 Kings. Sorry, I want to back up just a bit. It comes out of 1 Kings chapter 18 and 19. It's a story about Elijah. And Elijah, prophet of God, was not thought well of in kind of his people around the culture. So king, queen of the people of Israel didn't believe in our God, Elijah's God. They believed in Baal. So there were these prophets of Baal, and apparently the people of Israel continued to kind of go back and forth where did they want to follow God or did they want to follow Baal, and where did they want to be? So there's this great challenge, and maybe you're familiar with this story, this great challenge that takes place between Elijah and the prophets of Baal. He challenges them to see whose God will show up and supernaturally consume a sacrifice. So he lets the prophets of Baal go first. There's 450 if I'm remembering right. And they go first and they build an altar and they cut up a bull and they put all the pieces on it. And then they begin to cry out to Baal to show up, and they do all of the things that are appropriate in their culture of calling their God to action. They cry out and they scream and they cut themselves, and throughout the entire thing, Elijah is watching and really mocking them. Maybe your God's not a real God, your God won't show up, maybe your God's busy, he's in the bathroom, and it's this very comical kind of scene taking place. And they can't get Baal to burn the sacrifice that they put before him. So then it's Elijah's turn. And I'm not going to tell all the details of the story, but Elijah makes the ability for God to show up seemingly impossible as he builds the altar and he fills it with water, and then he cuts up the pieces of the bull and he adds more water and he adds more water and he drenches it, making it surely impossible that any of the wood or sacrifice or anything can burn up. The story says that he called out to God, he prayed to God, and immediately fire came from heaven and it devoured every bit of what was there. It took the sacrifice and the altar and all the water that was even in the ditch, the trough that had been dug around it. It devoured the stones and even the dust, it says. All of it was gone. And the people of Israel said, Elijah's God was the real God, and they decided this is who they would surrender to. But the king and queen, who were made to look like fools, as with all their prophets, weren't very happy about what Elijah had done or the way in which Elijah had made them look. So they decided, Jezebel decided that she would have Elijah killed. Elijah finds out, runs, and in the process of his running, he cries out to God and he asks that God will take his life. And God hears his prayer, just as he did with the sacrifice, but instead of taking his life, the story tells us that God put him to sleep. And then that God fed him. And then that God put him to sleep again. And then that God led him to this cave, and in this cave and in this space alone with God, Elijah was able to rest and be taken care of. Elijah was provided for by God. And then there is this story that we sometimes look at, but we look at separately. We miss what it's connected to because we need to know the battle took place between Elijah and the prophets of Baal, and the people are coming after him to kill him, and he runs away and he wishes he was dead, and then he ends up in this cave. And this is where we find this story that says that God came and spoke to Elijah, but he did so not through the windstorm and not through the earthquake and not through the fire, but in a gentle whisper, some translations say. Or I like the translation that says in the sound of sheer silence. Elijah heard from God. It was in this place of rest and provision and time in the presence of God that Elijah was able to meet God. And from this place of resting, of ceasing, of stopping, of Sabbath in a sort, Elijah was sent back out into his calling, sent back out into what God had called him for, had created him to, had asked him to be. Scripture is full of these examples of what it looks like for the faithful women and men of God to get away and be alone with God. And it's part of the reason we have been talking about and encouraging the practice of Sabbath. So I hope that this conversation is of value to you and your journey. Thanks for joining us in it. Again, sorry about the video, but we hope it's a blessing. I want to pray before we cut from me alone into that. Jesus, meet us here in this time, in this space, in this conversation about Sabbath. Remind us that, like Elijah, you long to be alone with us in our best times and in our hardest times, in our most difficult days and in our most joyous days. God, meet us. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Dave, Callie, thank you for being here and allowing us to have a conversation as we wrap up the Sabbath series that we've been on, the conversation that we've been a part of, so that you know, if you're watching, it's always our intent to wrap up with kind of a Q&A. Because we're not in the room together, that's made more difficult. So the three of us are going to sit and share with you some thoughts and reflections and just last things that we have as we think about Sabbath and all that's going on. Plus, trying to respond to some of your questions. Thank you if you sent them. If you didn't, we've heard some of them in passing, so we hope we answer several of them along the way too. All right. So let's start with this. What are some things that maybe you learned newly or that stood out to you in new ways as we talk about Sabbath in this series? And if not you personally, maybe even things you heard others say, right. I'd never heard this before.
Yeah. Ladies first.
Okay. I think one of the new things for me in this series was the connection to Sabbath and justice, which I really appreciated Dave preaching on last week. I honestly had never seen that they were so connected together. I honestly have felt like sometimes justice and Sabbath seem to be opposing in my life, meaning sometimes my mission or purpose or drive kind of takes over my rest. And so to see that not only is life supposed to have both, but actually God throughout the scriptures had interweaved this beautiful connection to Sabbath and justice. That was a new thought, new idea, new thing from scripture for me. That was mine.
Yeah.
And it's all there.
Thank you.
You start looking at the scriptures with that lens on, with that view, and it's packed. It's overwhelming how much is integrated between the two.
Yeah.
But yeah, we think of this idea of rest as withdrawal from mission. In the same way as fasting is a letting go of the normal practices. It's a pull back from what we would normally do. Whereas the scriptures still talk about engagement, and having eyes to see those around us that are still in need. And so it's not just about us, but in many ways it's pulling back to regain the perspective of God's heart in God's mind and aligning ours with His. And when we do that, that propels us forward again. So
yeah, and I think you're right. As you open up that piece of justice, it's everywhere. You can't hardly find a Sabbath passage that isn't talking about justice. And even as we created the series, there was some intentionality of walking towards these blessings, these gifts of Sabbath. I may need help as I try and think back through all of them, but we started with stopping, so ceasing our normal practices, resting, delighting, worship. From there was community next. Oh, I've gone blank. From there, I can only think. The problem is I can only think of 7, and I feel like there's supposed to be 8 of them. From there, I think we went into community. The reality that it's not just personal practice, but it is also a communal practice. So how do we think about Sabbath together and practicing it together? From community, again, I can only think of 7. I feel like I'm leaving something out. From community to mission, because of the idea that we do need to see mission and then let Sabbath launch us into mission. And then we wrapped up with this look at justice, which obviously ties with mission, but also just overwhelms so much of sabbatical speak throughout the scriptures, whether you're talking about Sabbath as a day, or sabbatical as an extended practice that comes, or year of Jubilee, or all these scriptural passages that we might say are Old Testament, yet they're clearly not Old Testament because it's where Jesus began his preaching ministry, was with the talk of Jubilee and Sabbath and freedom and justice and restoration that comes from that. So so big is it a part of it. And I still feel like maybe I left one out, but I can't think of what it was.
I think it was one that you did. So
it probably was. It probably was. But I've lost it. Oh, we started with just kind of a summary, talking about it as a gift. That's why I can't think of it. Talking about it as kind of a gift is where we started. So anything else that stood out or was reinforced? Or that was new or reinforced?
I think in some of the conversations I've had, and certainly true for me in history, not so much a reminder, I guess, in this series, is this idea of the experience for many of us growing up of Sabbath being more on the legal bent of things, the do's and don'ts of Sabbath. And and then the guilt attached to whether we practiced or not, those do's and don'ts. And just the reality that, our tendency, our default tendency, I think in most things in following Jesus is to gravitate towards legalism because it's cleaner, it's neater. There's a box. The do's and don'ts, especially when you're getting leadership to a diverse body, is easier than grace and all the negotiations of grace, where you actually have to deal with context and people and what they're experiencing. So the one size fits all, this is what it looks like, do it. And not that I would say my experience was a negative one, and I think true for others. It was just what life was. This is what we did on Sundays and didn't do on Sundays, and some struggle as kids when our peers could go out and play and do their things. I remember joining a community football team, and I was so excited to be finally playing football, and then learning that most of their games were on Sundays, and I had to pull out of the league. So some of those struggles that were there, but again, just this idea of Sabbath keeping was really about the rules. And the purpose of Sabbath, and again, it's all there and it's all clear, but we didn't have that emphasis. The Sabbath was made for man, and it is a gift and it is a blessing. And that rest, being free to rest, which a lot of, it comes back to the justice thing. A lot of people don't have that freedom to rest. Again, it's just such a wonderful gift that God gives us. And so approaching it from purpose rather than rules, I think, is what I've heard a number of other people have said that this has been an eye-opener again.
And so important for us to have grace, I think, on the trajectory of how that happened. Remembering this abstract idea of Sabbath existed, both in Old Testament, that's what we see. So it's kind of this abstract, what do we do with it? As more and more rules came, it came to just make it less abstract, more clear. That was really the original intent of the rules. Same with some of our upbringings and the rules of what you do or you don't do on Sabbath. I had someone just recently mention, can you or can you not go eat in a restaurant on Sabbath? And which is a great question that we should wrestle with. But remembering the rules came to clean up some of the abstraction, and then eventually we got distracted from the practice, the purpose, the mystery of this interesting thing, and we got absorbed in the rules.
Yeah.
And it became rule following rather than participating in the gift of Sabbath. So recognizing that, having some grace on it, but then looking and going, okay, wait, I don't want to be stuck on the rules. There's a point and there's a purpose. So let's see if I can find my way back towards the goal, towards the gift, towards what God intends and intended in the scriptures. I think that's so good.
I was just going to say, I love the conversation because people who are listening, us in this room, we come from like different background perspectives of Sabbath, of some super legalistic from talking to people. And then my experience is actually kind of like nothing. And I say that like we went to church, but other than that, like that Sabbath was like 2 or 3 hours on Sunday, and to find ourselves having lots of different experiences that are coming into this, I think is valuable to hear from others.
Yeah, and I wonder what of that is trajectory pendulum swing. Yeah. So reality of abstract became legalistic, throw away the legalism and get back to a place that's less defined. And in much of the West, in the States for sure, Sabbath became synonymous with going to church. Right. And that was it. It was about going to church. So you went to church, and quite often you went to church in the morning and you went to church in the evening, and that was Sabbath. And it missed many of kind of the beautiful pieces of what we've tried to focus on in the last few weeks. So let's switch let's switch direction just slightly. We're already there, but talk about some personal reality of it. So personal attempts at Sabbath, personal practices, great successes you have, or great failures. Maybe things you've tried and going, yeah, that didn't help, that didn't work, or we tried this and that blew up in our face. Or one of the things we have tried to give people, and we're going to make this available soon, is some like really practical handles to say, what do I do? So what are ours? Like, what are our personal handles and practices? What have we tried that went well or that didn't? So that we can just share some of that with other people.
Right. I think going back to that one size fits all mentality is to give people permission to say one size does not fit all.
Absolutely.
And so sort this out between you and the Lord as to what it needs to look like for you, just because our realities are so diverse.
Yeah.
Again, I think for me growing up, where Sundays everything was closed, that was an enforced thing in society and community, and so there was a little bit more of a one size fits all ease. But even then, again, it was more about going to church and not doing other things. And it really wasn't about experiencing Sabbath rest and joy and delight and communion with the Lord and community. And so I think if all of those intents that God has for Sabbath are built into it, I recognize that we need to find our own way of experiencing that. And I think of that on two fronts. One is thinking in terms of seasons, and we have different seasons of life.
Oh yeah.
Sandy and I graduated to the empty nest season of life, and so finding time and making time is easier for us just in the everyday life. You guys are in the family season of life, and you're in the middle, well, not quite middle, but you're moving towards middle. You're out of the diaper stage in toddlers where there's so much dependency and so much attention there. So for young families to find Sabbath rest is going to look a whole lot different than those where kids can be sent out to play on their own, and you can have some space and time, to a season where we are, where we don't have those other obligations within our own home context. But then I was a pastor for 7 years, and Sabbath for me, and as a pastor, and you're still living that out again looks so different. That's not my rest day
Absolutely.
on all kinds of levels. And so I need to look for other ways to experience Sabbath rest when I'm in that kind of vocation.
Yeah.
I know there's people who, you know, in the medical field or whatever, that have to work Sundays. And so, you know, they don't even get the community worship on a regular basis because of shift work and that sort of thing. So again, I think that freedom to say it's not about one day, and the principle and the purpose is what we need to be thinking through, and how do we build that into our lives. So that's kind of preface that to say it's not.
And how beautiful it always is for me as I think back to this, the reality that we're created different, with different personalities, with different structures in different seasons of life, in different workplaces, whether you're in ministry or missional work, or you're in a marketplace type job, or you're in, you work in someone's home. How beautiful is the reality that none of that surprises God. He recognizes our different schedules and our different personalities, and desires this time and this space with us in the way that allows us the freedom to figure out how it fits. It doesn't mean it shouldn't stretch us, because it should stretch us. It stretches all of us to actually begin to kind of take this in. This isn't just plug it in where it's easy, but move away from the guilt. That's right. There is a discipline. Move away from the guilt. Move away from the stress, and say, God loves me so much. He desires to spend an intentional, separate 24 hours with me. How do I make that happen? Like, what a beautiful gift to figure out how to do that. Again, hard, stretching, discipline, but what does that look like? So for us, we shared when we started this series, we had not clarified or defined what that would look like in Africa. It was very clear for us in the States. It was folks knew it. We proclaimed it, sometimes with pushback. People didn't always like it, but we would say, this is when we do this. So over the last 8 or 9, 10 weeks since we've been working through the series, we have been trying to be more intentional about saying, how do we find that? It's not Sunday. For me, Sabbath is not Sunday. That's my biggest work day of the week, preaching or not. I'm at work when I'm gathered with our body. Love you, love our church, but it's my job. It's my work. So it looks very different, as you mentioned, but. So we've been trying to figure it out, and how do we do it with the family and with kids, and we still don't have it fully clarified, but we moved back to a system that looks somewhat like we did in the States, where sometime on Friday afternoon, evening, we walk into Sabbath, and we kind of mark it, and we declare it, and then it lasts the next 24 hours. And yet even yesterday, I started realizing there's some things we're not doing yet I want to start doing. Because sometimes it has to shift or drift, which most people should absolutely not do. Most people should put it on your schedule and leave it there. And it's known. But again, when you work in a ministry type context, and other people have different schedules, and I have to have an elders meeting once a month. It's typically on Saturday morning. Elders, I love you, but that's not Sabbath either. So it means a shift and a reimagining on those weeks, which again, most people shouldn't. But so for us, sometimes it takes looking at the week, and I just thought about this again a day or two ago. It takes looking at the schedule and saying, this week's Sabbath for 24 hours is scheduled here. Everything else gets pushed aside. It happens here. So for us, that intentionality has been something we've been trying to work real hard at getting back towards.
Right. And I would say, what doesn't work for us tends to be if we don't talk about it. Yeah. Right. And if we don't have it planned and I say that word even loosely, because some people hear planned and you think rigid. Yeah. But if we don't have, we're even in the past couple of weeks, like making sure we say, hey, our schedule's changed, so we need to shift Sabbath. So what doesn't work is when we don't communicate it. For me, what also doesn't work is when I leave my kids out of it. Right. So when we started practicing Sabbath, it's funny that you said that, we were young parents with kids in diapers. And I remember thinking that Sabbath was supposed to be like a day of nothing. So it shows that my perception of it was off, but like we were kind of supposed to do nothing.
Withdrawing from rather
Yeah.
than engaging.
Yeah, and I remember
You should have seen those first 2 weeks when we didn't change the kids' diapers.
well, that is exactly what I was
Totally
going to say.
joking, but
I remember being frustrated and actually not liking it because I was like, I mean, I still have to change these children's diapers.
Still work to be done.
Like it doesn't mean all of your responsibilities, and even like the kids are still, God has given them, under us, and so I think the best times, or when it really shifted, was like, let's make a Sabbath for the whole family, and that has been what has worked for us. Now,
Absolutely.
Dave already mentioned we're at a different stage of life than other people, so you have to think of it in your context. And we've done lots of different things with our kids. Like we've had where we start Sabbath with going and getting ice cream with them, trying to say, what do the kids enjoy? What do we like doing together? And incorporating that. So bringing the kids into it actually has been a really good joy. And then I don't know if moms or parents or anyone, if you're consumed with work or productivity or fill in the blank, we're really asking the question, what brings me joy? Could be like a difficult thing. Like, what brings me joy? I'm so overwhelmed. I don't know how to answer that question. So I think looking at these times as like almost like experiments.
Right.
Like we're going to say it's going to happen, but this is an experiment. And so when you look at it that way, it helps you kind of test some things out. Like I really like walking and being outside with my children on Sabbath. And it can be something to that or something small to I really enjoy a cup of coffee with a good book for even 15 minutes. It would look different at different times, but asking you, what does bring me joy? So
build those joy pieces into it for sure. Yeah. By the way, if you guys are going to do Sabbath starting with ice cream, we're happy to be part of your family.
Right.
You want to come join?
You can invite us into that Sabbath practice. So.
Yeah, it does often do dessert before dinner or dessert before and after, and because we will sometimes get the kid. I mean, we've done that on Friday afternoon sometimes. Pick Emmy up from school and drive from there to Foxdale and have ice cream at Gigi Bonta, and they're so excited. And we say, do you know why? It's Sabbath. Like we've begun Sabbath. So those markers that help identify. You talk scheduling. One of the things we have got to get better at, I've realized in the last couple of days, is very clearly saying Sabbath started. You mentioned last week when you preached the two candles. Right. And interestingly,
like markers.
I'd never heard that.
Right?
I'd heard about a candle. I'd heard about this idea of our Jewish brothers and sisters who do a great job with the idea of a container. It begins and it ends and it's very clear, and a candle often. I'd not heard the two, and I was really fascinated. So for us trying to figure out what are our containers, what are our things that say it started and now we're finished. So we move back into the rest of life. Whether it means there's ice cream on both ends or candles throughout or some way of, we've done that at times. Candles at dinner, maybe on the night that we do Sabbath dinner together, or starting with a meal we really enjoy. So like the first meal is a big, like we love, but what are the kind of ways that we mark? We've done some of it, but we have not yet gotten something that works consistently for us. Yeah.
I think a question I get a lot from people is just, what about chores? What about things around the house? I mentioned, we had to change our kids' diapers. We didn't just leave them, but I think and this is super practical, but talking through and working through things like cooking. There are some things I love to cook, and so we will choose those things to cook on a Sabbath. Whether it's I love cooking breakfast, I love cooking pizza, and then there's other things I really don't want to do. And so a lot of times one meal will be ordering, and just talking through that and thinking through. And I never do laundry on the Sabbath. I'm just gonna say I never do washing. I never fold a thing of laundry, but it's not a legalistic thing where it's just I really don't enjoy that, so I'm just gonna leave that off for 24 hours.
Right.
But it doesn't mean I don't wash a piece of silverware, so talking through with your spouse or with your friends, with others, talking with others about it, and really figuring out the piece of what really does bring me joy, and the joy of cooking a meal that we all sit down together. That can be really joyful. I have a sister-in-law that actually doing laundry brings her joy. So I'm giving freedom to all the people that love doing laundry right now. But just working through the things that I'd love to just not do that for 24 hours, and thinking through that. So.
And that's where the planning
Absolutely
has to happen. And again, scheduling seems hard and fast and moves us towards that legal piece of it. But if the conversation doesn't happen,
absolutely,
if there isn't intentionality, if there isn't the pre-planning, so that we don't have to engage in this during that time, we're free to it. If we don't pre-plan, it's not going to happen. And it is that reality that there's a discipline. These are called spiritual disciplines.
Yeah.
And so there is an intentional attitude that we have to bring, and a thinking through, and a talking about. And whether that's in a family context, it's talking as a family. If it's couples, talking as spouses. As singles, you've got a friendship circle.
Absolutely.
And if you're going to set up boundaries,
any kind of boundaries,
in order for you to practice this, your friends need to know that, in a sense, you're off limits during this time, or you're together during this time doing this particular thing and not this sort of thing. So that those things happen. So that conversation has to be there with whatever your community that you're practicing Sabbath with is involved. Coming back to the joy thing, and I don't know if this is something that we can maybe think of as a preaching series or as a teaching series along the way, is, have you done any work with spiritual pathways? The idea that it's asking the question, what brings me joy, but what connects me best in worship? What connects me best in being in tune with God, being able to hear from God? What are my worship practices that I love? And whether that's celebration, or whether that's solitude, or whether that's nature, or whether that's service. There's, I think, about 9 spiritual pathways that they talk about.
It's interesting.
That allow us to, again, it's not so much that we hold back from all these other things that are part of our everyday life, but that we purposely engage in those things that connect us well with God, and that allow us to meet with Him and to hear from Him, and to worship Him. So it's those joy pieces.
Absolutely.
And it's we're wired different. God's made us different. And it's this idea that we don't have to do it all the same.
Yeah. Robert Mulholland has a great book that ties spiritual formation and spiritual disciplines to our personality styles. So he uses he talks about Jung, what we commonly refer to as the Myers-Briggs, and he talks about how we need to think about disciplines to do 2 things, actually. 1, connect with what is us easily, and 2, stretch us into the side that is less dominant for us, because in his understanding, that's what it means for us to be kind of fully human. So, sure, extroverts, they want to be with people, they want to be. So how do they strengthen that side of solitude that doesn't come natural, but it's important? And so really fascinating as you talk about that. 2 things I want to personally explore too, as we talk about Sabbath, and obviously not today, but at some point, is there seems to be something really beautiful and valuable in Sabbath in its original context, seemingly starting in the evening. So sundown to sundown. As we talk about preparation and planning, it seems to me there is a way in which if we do that, if we start in the evening, we've been able to prepare better. So maybe we cook some things early, or we do yard work or housework, or we have a time That's one of the things in Sabbath I want to also do more exploration of, both kind of personally and so what does it look like to start in the evening and then overflow into the evening? And we've done that to a degree, but really grasping like the idea of kind of the Jewish daily life was an evening to evening life.
Right.
It was a from sundown to sundown, as opposed to us often thinking of sun up to sundown. So there's something really fascinating in that I want to explore.
And the nice
I had
thing,
another one I forgot.
since you forgot,
You're good. Go.
The nice thing about that is there's actually 8 hours of sleep that's part
Absolutely.
of that rest period. If you're doing sun up to sundown,
Yep.
there's unless you build in a Sunday afternoon nap, which
Absolutely. Yeah.
we often were forced to do.
Sure.
But the sundown to the sundown again,
Yeah.
you've got physical rest that is part and parcel of that package
Yeah.
already. It's built in.
Yeah. I often tell people, we're going to get to this in a moment, but I often tell people who talk about the idea that they can't find 24 hours of Sabbath, which again, we'll come back to, but to include their night's sleep.
Right.
It's like you got 6 or 8 hours right there. Like you've already started. So use that 6 or 8 hours and just build a few more on it. Anybody can get to 12. So what does that look like? Let's do that. Let's move from kind of some of our personal practice to what are responses that we hear. And we've talked about this some, but what are common responses that come up with the idea of Sabbath? And let me start with saying 3 kind of general ones, and then we can build on these. It seems that there are some people who hear the talk of Sabbath, they hear it preached on or taught on, they read a book, they fall in love with it, they start practicing, they dive all in, and they then mark life based on before Sabbath and after Sabbath. So this is before I did Sabbath, and this is after I did Sabbath. Sabbath has been a big deal for us for not quite a decade yet. Soon after the kids were born, we kind of started practicing it. And at one point, Callie would have used the statement that Sabbath had saved our life. That it had been so significant in what we'd done. So we are some people who somewhat mark life before Sabbath and after Sabbath and how significant it has been for us. A second response seems to be the idea that some, they hear this and they go, man, that's a good idea. I kind of like the thought, and maybe they dabble in it or they try a week or two or even a couple months, but they kind of explore, or they go, man, that was a really great sermon series, and it makes no real life change. Like it just kind of goes away, and they heard some things and they learned some things, but there's no real life change in it. And then the third seems to be those who say, no, I'm not interested for a multitude of reasons, but no, I'm not going to do it. I'm not interested. This isn't going to be a part of my life. This can't work. That's right. But basically just dismiss it for, again, a multitude of reasons. Unrealistic, not possible, can't fit in my schedule. Those seem to be kind of the most common responses I've heard as I've talked about Sabbath and explored it and preached on it really a ton of times over the last decade or so. So let's talk about those responses. Maybe something else, or maybe ways we need to kind of dive into that a little more. What are your thoughts on that?
Let me start with the third one.
Absolutely. So those who just dismiss it.
Just dismiss
Yep.
it. And I guess, part of my first response thinking is, it's one of the 10 commandments. Jesus said, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. And again, we don't want to swing to a legalism to that, but God's law is written on our hearts.
Yeah.
And if we understand the heart and mind of God, there was purpose behind all of those commandments. And, they've often been divided into those that help us understand our relationship with God, and then those that help us understand our relationship with one another.
Yeah.
And even though we're under grace and not under the law, there aren't any of those other 10 commandments that we just dismiss and go, doesn't work for me, so I'm just going to leave it.
Yeah.
All of those other commandments are still a part of how we relate to God, and how we live in community with one another. And so to take that one and say it's negotiable, in terms of whether I accept it as something I need to think about and integrate or not.
Yep.
Doesn't make sense in the big picture of what God's given us as a package in how we relate. And as we thought about, particularly as I did fresh thinking about Sabbath and justice, in a sense, that Sabbath law is a both and. It's how we relate to God, how we connect with God,
Yep.
and how we live with one another.
Absolutely.
So it's a bridge.
It's the kind of bridge.
It's
Yeah,
a bridge
absolutely.
between the
Yeah.
two in many ways. So
Yeah.
I don't think a dismissal of
Sure.
it completely is an option for us.
Yeah.
I do think we need to wrestle with it and think through what are God's purposes behind it.
Yeah.
And it's made for us. It's a gift to us.
Yeah.
How do we think about it? How do we
Yeah.
integrate it?
Two things that I feel like often get tied to exactly what you're saying. One is because when we talk about commandment, exactly right, we need to hold on to it because of that, but we end up back on the legalistic conversation. So some who say, I don't want to practice this because it just sounds too legalistic. I don't want to do it, or that was my background. It was just legalism, so I don't want anything to do with it. So hear me say, agreed.
Right.
Don't do it in a way that's legalistic. Like, that's not the way it was ever intended to be. So don't do it that way. Like, there is a fear that we have that I can't practice Sabbath or it becomes too legalistic and I don't want to be legalistic.
God
So
has
don't
set us
be.
free to do it otherwise.
That's right. So don't be legalistic.
Yeah.
As we talk about some practices or some ways we define it, sure, have some boundaries, have some guidelines, have some rules that exist, but don't make it about the rules. Don't be legalistic about it because it sounds terrible. Like, that doesn't sound like the Sabbath we've been talking about. It sounds horrible. So don't be legalistic. A second question that I think comes up around that is, isn't Sabbath Old Covenant practice? So isn't it part of the Old Covenant, the Old Testament, not the New Testament, and what we do in the New Testament? And we don't have time to dive deeply into that, but I just pretty quickly would say that's not the way I read the scriptures. To me, it seems like Sabbath is all over the life of Jesus. To me, it seems like Sabbath is all over the life of Paul. That's so much in the life of the early church. And I would even be willing to argue so much so, again, if we remember, early church believed Jesus, Jewish Messiah. So they're still very much practicing their Jewish practices. They're very much involved in that. But the Messiah has now come. So it didn't get rid of all that. It added to the fullness of what they saw in that and how they practice it and what they did with it and how they move forward in it. I would be willing to argue some of the reason we don't see it mentioned much in the New Testament, it was so assumed as a part of their lifestyle, it didn't need to be talked about. Obviously, we practice Sabbath. That's what the Old Testament tells us God's people do. Yeah. We're God's people. We don't even have to talk about that one. Let's talk about the hard stuff. So I would make that argument that it's not just Old Covenant, and not to mention, we've been on the series because we believe it is such a beautiful gift. Right. So what if it's Old Covenant? So what? Does that mean we shouldn't do it? Like, we just go, oh, well, that gift we don't get to use anymore. No, it's still available. Yeah. So let's participate in it. Not in legalism. Yeah.
And Chad, you
touched on
this early on in the series that, in a sense, this isn't about Old Covenant, New Covenant. This is about creation.
Absolutely.
This is a principle, and there's purpose and a practice by God Himself in creation of rest. And so it's a creation principle that we carry on that supersedes. Yeah. That's not the right word.
It's pre-covenants.
It's pre-covenants.
That's right. It's pre-covenants and therefore umbrella over all of them.
It runs through both. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
When you talked about the three people, the only thing I feel like I would add is I feel like I've been all three of those people. Is what I would say. Is I've been like and so maybe that's just a word of encouragement to those, if you're one of those three, to just be like, I still say Sabbath saved us. Like, Jesus obviously through Sabbath gave us this gift because we were young, we were I was new in ministry, I was having babies away from my family, under lots of pressure and stress, and I really think if we didn't make Sabbath a very integral part of our lives, that burnout would have come more easily, that just even more aggravation, whether towards the church or towards life, just the stresses of life at that season for us was very intense. And so, But in order to get to the place where I would say Sabbath is this beautiful gift that I really think has really helped, and not only physically sustain us, but I would say spiritually sustain us, like a renewal every week. To get to there, I probably started at it's not for me. We have too many stresses. I have really young kids. I don't even see how that's possible. To I'm gonna dabble in it, and honestly, dabbling won't ever take root, is what I would say. In order to really see the fruit of it, it's almost like you got to have this kind of more long-term commitment towards it. So, but I'd also say if you like miss a week, to just say, Lord, your mercies are new every morning, and so this week I'm gonna go towards it again. So
yeah. I think with that, a couple other things, specifics that get tied to these responses. We've talked about stage of life. Often folks will say it's just not possible with kids. I'm not sure there's a stage where it suddenly gets easier. Like we think maybe it'll get easier when they're a little older, it'll get easier, but then they get busy in new things and they don't get easier. And maybe when I'm on my job, it'll get easier. Maybe when I retire, it'll get easier. And I think every phase creates for us, every stage creates for us an opportunity to say, well, soon, like it's coming. And I think the truth is there's no time like the present. So we've talked about some kids stuff, incorporate kids. I'm single, so why do I need this? And I've even seen a lot of people in ministry who would say, I'm single, I don't need a day off the way married people or families need one, so I'm just going to work all the time. Well, we weren't created that way. So there's no time like the present. As we think about kids especially, recognizing the foundation that we're laying for them. What does it mean to create a way of life that says to our kids, this is a freedom and a gift that we get to experience, and diving into that. There's
one
also
thing I wanted to add with kids, we talked about, bringing them into Sabbath with delight of like ice cream, kind of something silly, but also bringing into the delight of worship, of looking at the birds, of looking at the trees, of saying, you love to sing and dance. I want you to do that freely. I want you to release them, to say, let's sing, let's stand up and dance, and
you don't have to dance well.
Well,
right.
You don't.
Or sing well.
Yeah, no. And to just incorporate them in the worshipful delight where they're like, oh, there is freedom and there is joy in this.
Yeah.
I think we have to think through that and understand how to hold the tension with things like kids and their activities also. So what do you do with sports? What do you for many people, they took the road of saying, none, doesn't happen. For other people, it's like, well, I can't tell them no, so all the time. What does it mean to so my challenge with sports, which we see much more in the U.S. or in the other side of the world than here, but I would encourage, be intentional about thinking through that. So don't just go one way or the other, but be very intentional, recognizing for your kids in many ways that's worship. Like that's a chance to use some of what they are. We don't want it at idolatry worship, but a way in which they worship God and understand that. Some, because of that, start and say, I just can't find 24 hours. We talked about that. If you include sleep, we had a great conversation with a colleague of yours early on in this series about Sabbath and his own life and the reality of his life structure doesn't easily allow for it. Okay, start somewhere. Just begin with something. I heard a pastor just this week say, his challenge was start with something, and yet he said in his personal experience, more often than not, the greatest blessings of Sabbath for him happen in the last 4 to 8 hours of the practice. That there seems to be something about the longevity of it, something about the time that it takes for it to happen, that some of those gifts and blessings come at the very end of practicing that. So there seems to be something true about it being 24 hours, about it being a long period. And let me just say one more thing connected to that. Whether it's those who dabble in it and can't get there, or it's those who absolutely refuse it, we need to just be honest about the reality. We are addicted. Had a question come in saying, why is it so hard for us to rest? Why are we so restless when we try and rest? And it's because we're addicts. We are addicted to productivity, to success, to busyness, to being celebrated for succeeding. ministry folks, we are addicted to being needed, to being wanted by the people in our ministry or in our church. We are absolutely addicted to all of these things that aren't of God. And like any other addict, when you begin a practice, it's slow. It doesn't always start easily. Addicts give up what they're addicted to, and they start with the jitters. They start with restlessness. They have to detox. We have to detox from our addiction to so many things in our life for Sabbath to ever fully take root, which may mean that week 1 is awesome, and week 2 is kind of like, I don't know, and week 3 is horrible. And we've got to continue to push through that, because the same thing happens with other addictions and other realities of what happens. If we've given you the idea that when you start practicing Sabbath, it's just immediately awesome, it's not. It's hard when it begins. If we've given you the idea that once you get there, it's always awesome, it's not. We will constantly try to pull back to another way of life. So recognizing we are addicted. We're addicted to all those things that aren't of God. And we have to consistently refuse them and choose Jesus. In the addiction world, they will often talk about staying away from their addiction a day at a time, because they recognize it's never just fully gone. Yeah. So the same is true as we choose Jesus over everything else. It seems there's a reason that it says we take up our cross daily. Yeah. It is an intentional, daily, regular commitment and practice, because everything else will constantly tug at us and pull at us.
Yeah. I don't remember the exact quote that I gave last week, but that idea that Sabbath is about resistance, and it's a pushback against this idea of productivity that we are so given to. And a lot of that ties into our self-worth and our value.
Sure.
And if we're not being productive, we think that we're lazy or that we're a failure. And so there is that tension of value systems that we hold on to, and how we work with that. Just to camp on the idea of breaking addictions, we rarely are able to break an addiction all by ourselves.
That's right.
And that's this whole idea. We're made for one another. We're made for community. And so if you're wanting to set this as a discipline in your life, involve other people in, and some of us have other people built into our lives, but not everybody does. So invite others into the conversation, invite others into the accountability, invite others into the support of you being successful at this. Practice together.
Absolutely.
Rather than trying to do it on your own. If we struggle alone, we lose. That's kind of just the reality of life. And so there is this discipline in it, and the studies that talk about forming new habits.
Yep.
There has to be that consistency over a period of time. I can't remember, they say 60 days or 90 days.
Right.
In order for something to become a part of who we are. And so disciplining ourselves and pushing ourselves towards that make and break point where it can actually be a part of our everyday, rather than something that we dabble in and out. It's never going to take hold.
That's right.
Without some of that.
That's right. And you made me remember the other piece that I said, that I was thinking I want to explore more, is the question of how a church does a better job making sure we live life as a Sabbath people. Not just talking about Sabbath, so saying Sabbath, 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 now go do Sabbath. But instead, we are a Sabbath people. So we think about Sabbath with our worship gathering. Not just Sabbath is worship, but it's a part. So what does it mean to think about that in a way that doesn't overwork or overwhelm people? What does it mean to do things like not planning meetings in Sabbath time? Because we've decided as a community, as a body of faith, we practice Sabbath in this time. Sometimes together, sometimes apart, sometimes portions of it together, sometimes portions of it apart. But this is Sabbath for our community. So let's Sabbath together, which again is really what the Jewish people had. This was a mark. We are God's people. Sabbath declares us as so. Much the same way circumcision did. It declares us as God's people. So what does it look like to practice this together? I really would love to see, I want to personally explore that more, and then think about how we as LCC think about that communal corporate practice of Sabbath and Sabbath keeping. Because I really believe it can it changes us. It changes individuals, it changes families, it changes our community, it changes our world. And it says there's something different about the people who love Jesus than any other people on the face of the earth. There's something different about us and who we are and what that looks like. So what does that mean and what does that look like?
And that is only going to be attractive
Absolutely.
if there's joy.
Yes.
Exactly.
If it's a weight,
Yes.
then nobody's going to be putting their hand up
Right.
and say, "Can I come join
Can I be
you?"
a Sabbath
That's exactly
person?
right.
Yeah. So
That's exactly right. And figuring that out, that rest and that joy in that. Somebody did ask that question of how they find that joy. And I think Callie had said this, and I would say again, you practice. Like you just test things out, and some things work and some things don't work. And some things are joyful, and doesn't a picnic sound like a wonderful joy or something like that to some people? Yes. To the other person who has to pack it all and prep it all and haul it in and haul it out.
There's ants and
That's
there's
right.
wasps and,
The beach for some people is an incredible joy. For other people, it's like there's sand everywhere, and then I haul it home and it's in my car. I mean, so we explore that and we figure that out and remember Jesus loves us so deeply that he wants us to enjoy life and the time we get with him. So how do we find joy? It's not about legalism. It's not about the rules. The rules help us find joy. The rules get everything else out of the way so we can come back to it. So that's so big.
And I feel like I can't, when y'all were talking about addictions and joy and what brings you joy, and I mean, I really encourage you to notice. You might even have to write things down as you experiment. And I feel like I can't leave this conversation without saying, thinking about technology and our phones. I can't leave it without just mentioning it, because I might use FaceTime and connect with family or friends from far, and that can be a beautiful, joyful thing that I use with my phones. Or I might spend way too much time scrolling Instagram or something that I have places on Instagram that I love that speak scripture, that can be good. So again, it's not legalism, it's just taking note. Because I had one day where at the end of the day, I was like, I feel yucky and just not real joyful. And I started talking to Chad, and I had spent so much more time on my phone that day. And I was like, I can mark that. I can notice that and say, hey, even putting to rest things. And Chad has more substantial practice in this than I do. But putting to rest some things, taking note when you're like, that just really wasn't, that leaves me feeling empty. And to just note that and say, okay, I want to set that aside, and not in a legalistic way, but to just say for myself, I'm going to set that aside for part of my Sabbath.
Yeah. What are the things that are life-giving?
Yeah.
So what are the things that are life-sapping? And
Yeah.
choose those things that give us life. Yeah.
And with that intentionality of recognizing life-giving, life-sapping, and connected to Jesus. Because there are things that we think are life-giving, but they're not. They're really feeding our idolatry, our sin, so really, and I think that's what's so much more important than legalism is intentionality. The rules we define, they're not about legalism, they're about intentionality. We have to be intentional about this pursuit, about finding life deeply connected to Jesus, because we can so easily slip into the other. But the call of Christ, right? John 10:10 says, I've come to give you life. What kind of life? Life that is full, overflowing, abundant. That's the desire of Jesus. So how do we find it, and how do we get there, and how do we choose that consistently? I think with that intentionality, which is a great last word. So thank you. We've been here a little longer than is normal, and we're going to share a couple other things with you. But Dave, thank you for coming and for being a part of this. Thank you for the role you played in preaching and being a part of the series, for the influence that you are in our church. We're thankful for you and Sandy, and the journey we get to be on with you, and the church we get to be on with you as we walk forward in this. Callie, thank you. Sabbath exploring has been a big part of the life Callie and I've lived together for the last many years. And we're trying to figure out how to do it well with our kids and to do it well as we lead a church. So thank you guys for letting us have a conversation together. Church, we love you and we bless you. So go in peace. Hey, it's me again. Really appreciate Dave and Callie and the chance we had to have that conversation. Thank you to one or two of you who sent a few thoughts and comments or questions to us. I hope we were able to cover some of those. If not, reach back out. We'd love to. Others of you, if you have questions, thoughts, comments, even challenges or pushbacks, ways that you want to or need to or desire to talk about Sabbath, would you reach out? We are having this conversation because Sabbath has been such a significant part of my life, of Callie's life, of our family's life, of our journey forward with Christ. We believe that it has done wonders in making us the people that we are, and we want you to experience the same. It's why we've spent so much time in this place. It's why the elders felt that it was important. So let me finish this conversation that we've had with another story, because I think sometimes it's easy for us to miss how important things like this were to Jesus. In Matthew chapter 14, we find a story about Jesus in ministry. But before we get to Jesus in ministry, we find out that John the Baptist, a good friend of Jesus and his disciples, had been killed. He was killed by the king's daughter. I think I'm saying that right. No, it was the queen. Sorry, it was the queen who had asked the daughter. The daughter asked a favor of her dad. Sorry, I'm forgetting some of the details, which is sad because I just wrote all this down. But the daughter asked her father to have John the Baptist killed. So John the Baptist was killed, and Jesus and the disciples had gone off to grieve. And the story tells us that they were going off alone. So in verse 13, it says, as soon as Jesus heard the news, he left in a boat to a remote area to be alone. And then there's this transition into an interesting ministry story, because it says that as they were going, Jesus and the disciples, they came along a crowd of people that was following them. And the story says Jesus had compassion on them. So they stopped going where they were going to go be alone, to go grieve. They stopped heading out to be alone with God, and they got out of the boat and they began to do ministry. And the story says that Jesus healed many of those who had come, and then it came time to eat. And maybe you know this story. We're told that there were 5,000 or more people there and that they had no food. But Jesus and the disciples, in this miraculous way, fed this crowd of people who was gathered. Now, in my mind, Jesus has come somewhat new on the scene, trying to recruit disciples. He keeps saying to people, come, follow me. And now he has this massive crowd. He's healed many. He's fed them. This beautiful thing has happened. There is ministry momentum galore going on. These are the things revivals are made of. These kinds of scenes, these kinds of incredible feats, these kinds of signs of what God can do when God shows up. So what does Jesus do next? Again, important, just like the Elijah story, bringing it all together so we get it all. What did Jesus and the disciples do next? Verse 23 says, immediately after feeding the 5,000, then sending them away, immediately after this, Jesus, actually before sending them away, it says, immediately after this, Jesus insisted that his disciples get back into the boat and cross to the other side of the lake while he sent the people home. Jesus said to the disciples, go back where we were going. Go be alone with God, away from the crowds, away from all that's going on. Go be alone with the Father. And then it says, after sending them home, he went up into the hills by himself to pray. After the loss of a dear friend, Jesus and his disciples went to be alone with God. After a multitude of miracles, including feeding thousands of people all at one time, and this potential massive following that Jesus could have had, Jesus sent them away and went to be alone with God. As a Jewish rabbi, that's what they called him. He was clearly following Sabbath practice. He was going to the temple as they did. He was following through with many of the Jewish customs. They're not talked about or mentioned because it was so obvious to the Jewish population that was originally reading our gospel stories and in the latter New Testament. It was so obvious that Jewish things were still happening, they didn't need to talk about it. But on top of that, alongside that, we watch as a multitude of times Jesus stops. After the death of John the Baptist, after feeding the 5,000, a multitude of other times he stops and he goes away to be alone. He goes away to Sabbath, to stop and rest and delight and worship. It was a central aspect of who Jesus was. It was a central aspect of Jesus' ministry. And friends, aside from commandments, aside from our talk and some of the blessings that come, we need to be reminded that surely if Jesus, God in the flesh, needed time of Sabbath, needed to be alone with God, so do we. So my invitation to you, our invitation to you, is make space to be alone with Jesus. Rework your schedule. Grow in Sabbath practice. Practice it. Try it. Begin to explore what it looks like to give an entire day of your week, the space of that day. Not only that day, because all 7 days belong to God, but that day in a special and sacred way, to give it back to God and to watch as God works transformation in you and the community that you influence, your family, our church, your neighbors, your coworkers, and the list goes on. I think if we try it, the significance could be huge. Bless you. We love you. We hope to see your faces soon. Grace and peace be with you.